Ben Shapiro had William Lane Craig on his show to offer some facile rebuttals to atheist arguments.
Let's talk about a couple of those philosophy arguments from 101 that are constantly trotted out. I've had similar experiences. The most common one that I've heard, of course, is the problem of evil, the suggestion that how can God be good if so much evil takes place in the world? The more sophisticated version of the argument to me is not the problem of human evil, which seems pretty easily disposable.
The typical way in which theists try to dispose of the inconvenient fact that humans do evil and, if there's a God, that God allows it, is to point out that God gave us free will to commit evil and that free will is valuable enough that it's worth it to live on a planet with other people who use their free will to choose to cause suffering. This assumes, first, that we do actually have free will, which I don't think is coherent, at least not according to the definition of free will that theists often use, and that if we do have it, it's so valuable that having it makes up for all the suffering that results from people making decisions that hurt others. Even if we do have free will, I don't see why having it would be better than not having it, especially if God could have made us morally infallible such that we never even experienced any temptation to do anything bad. If I could never be mistaken about what the best thing to do is in any situation, and never feel any temptation to do anything other than the absolute best thing at all times, that would be pretty awesome. It's very hard to imagine why having free will would be preferable to that. Some theists say that God would not want us to be morally infallible robots because then our love for him would be caused by our programming rather than by a free choice, and that would mean it wouldn't be real love. Well, why not? Why is caused love any less real than uncaused love?
But the problem of natural evil things happening to children, a child with cancer, how does a good God rule over a world in which children die of natural causes, in which kids are born with Tay-Sachs, in which horrible things happen to good people?
Yes. In dealing with this problem, I think it's really important that we distinguish between what I call the intellectual problem of evil and the emotional problem of evil. There is no doubt that emotionally, the evil and suffering in the world make it very difficult to believe in God. It's a tremendous emotional obstacle. But intellectually, considered dispassionately as a philosophical problem, it's extraordinarily difficult to show that there's either any inconsistency or improbability between the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God and the evil and suffering in the world. The atheist would have to show that it is either impossible or improbable that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the natural and moral evil in the world.
We don't need to make a probability judgment. In order for the purpose of permitting evil to be morally sufficient, it would not be enough that such a purpose simply be so good that it outweighs the evil. I agree with Craig that we can't know whether God's purpose, if a God exists, is so good that it outweighs the evil he permits. But I don't think that matters because even if God's purpose does outweigh the evil he permits, in order for allowing that evil to be justified, it would also have to be the case that God does not have the power to achieve that purpose without allowing that evil. Craig believes that God, 1, is all-powerful, 2, is omnibenevolent, and 3, permits evil. You gotta pick 2, Bill. To say that all 3 are the case results in contradiction. Even if it is the case that the creator of the universe allows evil in order to achieve some purpose which is so good that its goodness is greater than the evil he permits, such a purpose is still not justified if God has the power to achieve it without allowing that evil. If he does not have the power to achieve it without allowing evil, then he is clearly not all-powerful. Sometimes apologists will rebut challenges to God's omnipotence by saying that doing incoherent things doesn't count because they don't mean anything. For example, the fact that God can't create a rock so heavy that even he can't lift it would be a contradiction. It wouldn't mean anything. Therefore, it doesn't count as something he can't do. Even if I grant this, I don't see how this rebuttal would work for the problem of evil, because the apologist would have to acclaim that it is self-contradictory to say that God can achieve his ultimate purpose without allowing evil. How would that be the case? The only end that can't coherently be achieved without allowing evil is allowing evil itself. Obviously, allowing evil can't be the purpose that is so good that it makes up for allowing evil.
And how could he possibly show that? We're simply not in a position to make those kind of probability judgments with any confidence. And so I think that the problem of evil, as difficult as it may be emotionally, Intellectually, it lays a burden of proof on the shoulders of the atheist, which is so heavy that it has proved to be unsustainable.
Then how did I just manage to sustain it? Even if it is the case that the creator of the universe allows evil for some greater purpose that makes up for the evil he allows, either he has the power to achieve that purpose without allowing the evil, in which case he is unjustified in allowing it and is therefore not all good or not omnibenevolent, or he does not have the power to achieve his purpose without allowing evil, in which case he is not omnipotent.
And these days, the other argument that is brought up an enormous amount is the supposed backwardness of the Bible itself and biblical morality. This happens largely with regard to, for example, homosexual marriage. It's been brought up with regard to abortion, which I think is more, again, easily disposable, because I think there's a solid secular argument in favor of the protection of human life.
In fact, the only argument you can make against such a reproductive right would have to be secular, because no argument against it can be explicitly found in the Bible. Nowhere in the Old or New Testaments does the Bible say that anyone has a moral obligation to carry a pregnancy to term. Exodus 21:22 seems to make a clear distinction between the crime of causing someone to miscarry and the crime of killing someone, although apologists quibble about the interpretation. Numbers 5:21 seems to recommend causing a miscarriage as a means of determining whether your wife has been unfaithful, although apologists quibble about the interpretation of that passage as well. However, regardless of whether these passages, which seem to make a distinction between terminating a pregnancy and killing a person, really do make such a distinction, there is no passage which says that terminating a pregnancy is forbidden anywhere in the Bible.
But homosexual marriage is the one that most often comes up. You also hear arguments that the Bible permits slavery.
Well, it gives explicit instructions about how to treat people you enslave, and different standards relative to whether the person is or is not a fellow Israelite. Leviticus 25:44 says, "Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves." What kind of hermeneutical contortionism do you have to engage in to make the case that the assertion, "you may buy slaves," doesn't permit slavery? Sometimes I hear apologists say that it was a different kind of slavery from the kind practiced in the antebellum South, as if there's a good kind of slavery. Also, while some of the slavery the Bible permits is debt slavery or indentured servitude, upon which the Bible places time limits and other restrictions, some of the slavery it explicitly permits is very much the exact same kind that the Confederacy practiced.
So if the Bible is so wonderful, then why are there all these weird sections of the Bible where it talks about wiping peoples from the earth, where it talks about enslaving other human beings? Some things that we would certainly consider moral evils today are contemplated by the Bible and not banned by the Bible.
Telling people you may buy slaves is more than just contemplating slavery, it's explicitly permitting it.
So why is that?
Well, let me address briefly first this question of slavery. When we hear the word slavery, Ben, we think of slavery as it existed in the American South.
Which, as I said, is also a kind of slavery endorsed by the Bible.
And as you know, that is nothing like the system that existed in ancient Israel.
Yeah, it is.
In ancient Israel, there was no social safety net sponsored by the state. There was no poverty program. So if a man got himself into a situation where he couldn't pay his debts, he could keep his family together and retain his self-respect by selling himself as an indentured servant to his creditor until he could work off his debts, and then he would have to be set free.
That only applied if you enslaved a fellow Israelite. Leviticus 25:46 says, with respect to non-Israelites who were enslaved, that ye may make them an inheritance for your children after you, to hold for a possession. Of them ye may take your bondmen forever. There was no requirement to set an enslaved person free if they weren't the same kind of person as you, which is something that biblical slavery had in common with American slavery.
After 7 years, he had to be set free in any case.
Not in the case that he wasn't a fellow Israelite. If you purchased an enslaved person who was not a fellow Israelite, Leviticus is very explicit and unambiguous in permitting you to keep that person enslaved forever.
So this was really a form of indentured servanthood. It wasn't slavery as we think of that term.
If the person who was purchased was not an Israelite, then yes, it was.
This was actually an anti-poverty program.
Even when it came to indentured servitude, why didn't an all-loving God, instead of permitting such servitude, command people to set up a social safety net, if that's what indentured servitude was supposed to provide?
And in some respects, I think it's better than what we have in modern Western culture, which destroys families, ruins people's self-respect because they're not working.
Is Bill going to run for office on a pro-indentured servitude platform? He might do well. The Texans would love it.
Whereas in ancient Israel, a man retained his self-respect. He worked for an income. He paid his debts. He kept his family together.
He worked for an income? That's not even how indentured servitude works.
And that, to call that slavery, is just a gross misrepresentation.
Well, apparently the Bible, the allegedly infallible word of God, is guilty of misrepresentation, because the word the Bible uses in Leviticus is eved, which means slave.
Now, the first thing you mentioned, I've forgotten.
Homosexual marriage, same-sex marriage.
With respect to some of these other moral questions, I think we need to remember the first premise of the moral argument. If there is no God, then there are no objective moral values and duties. Everything is socioculturally relative.
I agree that morals are socioculturally relative, but that doesn't detract from the argument from evil, because it seems clear to me that God, if he exists, doesn't even follow his own standards. A frequent argument apologists make is that if there is no God, then you can't say anything is evil, so pointing out that evil exists is actually an admission of the existence of God. The problem with this is that you don't have to believe in an objective standard of evil to point out the contradiction in the idea that there exists a supposedly all-powerful and all-good being allowing the existence of evil even as it's defined by that God's own standards. That's still a contradiction even if you don't agree with those standards. If an entity exists which is all-good and all-powerful, it is a contradiction to say that such an entity would allow evil to exist as that being defines evil. Any being that allows evil by its own standard of what evil is either not all-good or does not have the power to eliminate evil. Even allowing evil for the purpose of bringing about some good that outweighs said evil is not justified unless the being allowing the evil does not have the power to achieve that purpose without allowing that evil. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.